From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Thank God, our country regained its freedom from occupation. All the causes of the wars were destroyed. Our compatriots enjoyed wide security, and for the first time, the ground was prepared for the coming of a strong Islamic government.
As the Taliban takes a major step in reestablishing the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan by announcing its acting government, we'll look at some of the key figures and get an update on protests that continue to grow across the country. Then we'll go to the Gulf Coast in the United States to speak with the 2021 Goldman Environmental Prize winner, also known as the Green Nobel Peace Prize, in the heart of Louisiana's Cancer Alley, home to more than 150 petrochemical facilities. Now she's documenting the aftermath of Hurricane Ida.
Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Levine. I'm the director and founder of Rise St. James in St. James, Louisiana. And I just would like to report an oil leak at Marathon off Highway 18, West Bank in St. James, Louisiana. As you can see behind me, there's an oil field over here at Marathon. You can see the oil coming off the side of the tanks.
We'll also speak with investigative reporter Antonio Yuhas, who says the extent of damage from leak spills, flaring, ruptures, and chemicals released after Ida could be among the worst ever recorded. And we'll talk to Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz about how unemployment benefits for millions of U.S. workers expired on Labor Day, even as many states suffer the worst surge of the pandemic. And we'll talk with him about vaccine equity in the world. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Afghanistan, the Taliban's announced its acting government in Kabul. The cabinet does not include any women or any members of the former Afghan government. Mohammad Hassan Akhund, a close aide to the deceased Taliban founder, Mohammed Omar, was named acting prime minister. Abdul Ghani Baradar, a Taliban co-founder, will be his deputy. Sirajuddin Haqqani, the interior minister, is on the FBI's most wanted list for a 2008 attack in Kabul that killed 6 people. This comes as protests grow across Afghanistan. Hundreds of men and women rallied in Kabul Tuesday, with demonstrators calling on Pakistan to stop intervening to aid the Taliban. 2 people reportedly died Tuesday during another protest in Herat. This all comes as aid organizations warn of the looming humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, with the country's fragile healthcare system potentially facing collapse. We'll have the latest after headlines. The Centers for Disease Control said Tuesday 75%, that's 3/4 of U.S. adults, have received at least 1 dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. The milestone was announced as the U.S. soared past 40 million reported cases of COVID-19 since the start of the pandemic, with the Delta variant continuing to fuel the summer surge. Children currently make up more than 1/4 of new cases nationwide. In Florida, 13 school employees of public schools in Miami-Dade have died from COVID in the last few weeks. The district enacted a mask mandate despite efforts to ban the requirement by Republican Governor Ron DeSantis. All 13 COVID victims were African American. Elsewhere, New Zealand's eased its strict lockdown outside of its largest city, Auckland, after cases started to go down from August highs. Meanwhile, Cuba has become the first country to start rolling out vaccines for children 2 years and older. The 2 domestically produced vaccines, Abdala and Soberana, have not been approved by the World Health Organization, but local trials have shown an efficacy rate of more than 90%. In Brazil, massive crowds rallied in support of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro Tuesday, Brazil's Independence Day. "Only God will take me out of Brasilia," Bolsonaro told his supporters. The right-wing populist has been sowing doubt about the country's voting system ahead of next year's election. Counter-protesters also took to the streets to condemn Bolsonaro's attacks on the environment, education, and his mishandling of the pandemic.
We cannot wait for this genocidal government to keep on killing people. Everywhere in the world there are vaccines, and here we've got over 500,000 deaths, almost 600,000. We don't have to wait until 2022 for the elections. We need to kick Bolsonaro out now.
In Texas, Republican Governor Greg Abbott signed into law the state's sweeping new voter suppression bill, SB 1, Tuesday. The law bars drive-through and 24-hour voting sites, adds new identification requirements for absentee ballots, bans unsolicited mail-in ballot applications, and gives new authority to partisan poll watchers. Voting rights groups have vowed to keep fighting the law, which already faces at least 5 challenges in state and federal courts. Meanwhile, Governor Abbott has come under renewed fire over comments he made during the SB 1 signing ceremony, referring to Texas's recently enacted near-total ban on abortion. A reporter asked Abbott, quote, why force a rape or incest victim to carry a pregnancy to term?
It provides at least 6 weeks for a person to be able to get an abortion. And so, for one, it doesn't provide that. That said, however, let's make something very clear. Rape is a crime. And Texas will work tirelessly to make sure that we eliminate all rapists from the streets of Texas by aggressively going out and arresting them and prosecuting them and getting them off the streets.
New York Congressmember Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez blasted Abbott after the comments for his, quote, deep ignorance. President Biden visited parts of New Jersey and New York Tuesday that were hard hit by the remnants of Hurricane Ida last week. He spoke from Queens, flanked by New York's top elected officials.
Climate change poses an existential threat to our lives, to our economy, and the threat is here. It's not going to get any better. The nation and the world are in peril. That's not hyperbole. That is a fact.
Climate groups urged President Biden to take decisive action after his comments Tuesday. Sunrise Movement said, quote, if Biden does not deliver on at least a $3.5 trillion investment through budget reconciliation while he has a potentially fleeting Democratic majority, future generations will ask why he didn't do more when we still had the chance, they said. West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin has said he won't back more than $1.5 trillion in spending. Meanwhile, the U.S. Coast Guard is currently investigating reports of 350 oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. In related news, Louisiana officials revoked the licenses of 7 nursing homes that sent their residents to a warehouse in the town of Independence ahead of Hurricane Ida. 7 people died, and 800 people faced squalid, inhumane conditions there before being rescued. A coalition of over 1,500 environmental and rights groups around the world is calling for the United Nations to postpone its annual climate talks, COP26, scheduled for November in Scotland because of entrenched vaccine inequality. Climate Action Network says the countries most affected by the climate crisis are likely to be shut out of talks because of lack of access to vaccines, as well as prohibitive travel and quarantine costs. The coalition said in a statement, quote, there's always been an inherent power imbalance within the UN climate talks, and this is now compounded by the health crisis. It's difficult to imagine there can be fair participation from the global south under safe conditions, they said. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization blasted wealthy countries Tuesday for refusing to share excess vaccines and other COVID treatments.
It is the hoarding of these materials. We saw it in the beginning of the pandemic with PPE. But this is not just unfair, it's not just immoral, it's prolonging the pandemic, and it is resulting in people dying.
We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. The Mexican Supreme Court has unanimously ruled that criminalizing abortion is unconstitutional, a historic decision which paves the way to legalizing the procedure across Mexico. This is the president of the Mexican Supreme Court, Arturo Zaldivar.
A partir de ahora se inicia una nueva ruta.
From now on, there is a new path to freedom. clarity and dignity, which respects all those who are pregnant, especially women. Today is one more step in this historic struggle for equality, for dignity, and for fully exercising their rights.
Abortion has been severely restricted and penalized in all but 4 Mexican states. This comes after years of resistance and organizing by reproductive justice advocates in the Catholic country of Mexico. In other news from Mexico, at least one person is dead after a powerful earthquake struck near the coastal town of Acapulco, triggering a tsunami warning for the region. About 1.6 million people lost power. The 7.0 magnitude quake was also felt over 230 miles away in Mexico City. Bitcoin crashed to its lowest value in nearly a month Tuesday as El Salvador officially rolled out cryptocurrency as legal tender. For months, critics have warned the adoption of Bitcoin as an official currency in El Salvador could trigger an economic catastrophe, particularly impacting poorer communities that don't have access to bank accounts, computers, or smartphones. The controversial move, spearheaded by the Salvadoran president, Nayib Bukele, and approved by lawmakers earlier this year, has led to ongoing protests. A warning to our audience, the next story contains descriptions of torture and sexual violence. A harrowing new report by Amnesty International details the brutal violence faced by Syrian refugees who've been returned to the war-torn country. The group documented tortures, rapes, illegal detentions, and other serious human rights violations committed by the Syrian government and intelligence officers against over 60 people, including children. In one testimony, a mother described how Syrian authorities undressed her daughter, handcuffed and hung her on a wall while she was repeatedly beaten and sexually assaulted. And the 5 men accused of plotting the September 11th attacks appeared in a Guantanamo Bay military court Tuesday for the first time in over a year. The resumption of pretrial hearings comes just days ahead of the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. The case against the 5 men, which includes suspected mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, has been riddled with procedural problems, including the admissibility of evidence that was obtained by CIA agents under torture. The pretrial hearings, which have been prolonged for at least 9 years, were suspended in February 2020 due to the pandemic. The selection of a military jury will likely not begin until at least 2022. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, we begin today's show in Kabul, where the Taliban has taken a major step in reestablishing the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan by announcing its acting government. The new cabinet does not include any women or any members of the former Afghan government. The new acting prime minister is Mohammed Hassan Akhund, who was a close aide to the Taliban founding leader, Mohammed Omar. His deputy will be Taliban co-founder Abdul Ghani Baradar. The new Interior Minister, Sirajuddin Haqqani, is on the FBI's most wanted list for a 2008 attack in Kabul that killed 6 people. This comes as protests grow across Afghanistan. Hundreds of people rallied in Kabul on Tuesday, led by women, with demonstrators calling on Pakistan to stop intervening to aid the Taliban. Witnesses reported Taliban fighters beat protesters, and the crowd scattered after gunmen fired in the air. One protester condemned the Taliban's response.
The Islamic government is shooting at our people. The Taliban members are very unjust, and they are not human at all. They do not give us the right to demonstrate. They are not Muslim but infidels, as you can see from the situation we are in.
Many of the people protesting were women, saying women's rights are human rights. This comes as 2 people reportedly died Tuesday during another protest in Herat. Meanwhile, aid organizations warn of the looming humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, with the country's fragile healthcare system potentially facing collapse. For more, we're joined by Danish-Afghan journalist Najib Khaja. We recently spoke to him when he was in Kabul for the last 3 weeks, reporting for the Danish television channel TV2. He's now joining us from Copenhagen. In 2008, he was kidnapped by the Taliban. He later embedded with the Taliban while making a documentary for Al Jazeera. Welcome back back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Najib. Can you talk about who is this new government of Afghanistan?
It's actually a surprising outcome because all of us observers, we'd expected the Taliban to give Abdul Ghani Baradar the position as the new prime minister, but instead of him, they gave the position to one of the old school members, one of the more hardliner members of Taliban, Mullah Ahun, and it came really unexpected. But this outcome was also probably a result of the ISI leader, the Pakistani intelligence leader, traveling to Kabul and trying to sort things out between the different fractions in the Taliban, who had difficulties agreeing on who was going to be appointed for this post. And it ended up with a kind of a compromise because Mullah Ahun is somebody who doesn't have a strong power base, unlike some of the other top members. It's not as strong as their power base, so he's kind of a solution that probably the ISI leader suggested, so they could get on with their plans, the Taliban. And other surprises in this new government, negative surprises, is that there are almost no minorities represented. There's only a couple of Tajiks, which is the second biggest ethnic group in Afghanistan, and only one with Uzbek background, which is the fourth biggest ethnic group. And you don't have any Hazaras. And we're talking about the third biggest ethnic group, which are also, they're not only an ethnic minority, but they're also a religious minority because they're Shia Muslims. They don't have anybody in this new government. And the obvious, of course, lack of presence is also the women, which is half of the population. The Taliban said it also before they announced the government that there won't be any women in this government. So it's really been disappointing for the people who have been looking for a glimpse of hope.
And Najib, you mentioned the role of the ISI in sorting out the differences between the groups. Could you talk a little bit more about the role of Pakistan and the ISI in what is going on now and what will occur in the future in Afghanistan?
The ISI, they've assisted the Taliban since they took power in the mid-90s. They've been helping them with logistical support. They've been helping them with arms. They've been helping them with, advices, strategies. And of course, Pakistan has never admitted that they've been engaged that much with the Taliban, but several journalists, analysts, a lot of clear proofs have been put forward throughout the years that shows that this is the case. And the thing is that the problem for ISI has been that U.S. and the Pakistan are officially strategic partners in the region, but at the same time, they have different interests. The U.S. interest was that they wanted the former Afghan government to consolidate themselves, and the Pakistani government's interest was that they wanted a pro-Pakistani, anti-Indian government in Afghanistan. And the former Afghan government were very pro-Indian. So the Pakistan, through its branch, intelligence branch, ISI, which sometimes also operates some of their missions independently and also against the Pakistani government. I have to emphasize this nuance also. They've been assisting and supporting the Taliban so they could change the tides. So, and what happened after the Taliban toppled the Afghan government, the sources that I've been talking to, they've been telling telling me and other journalists also about disagreements between the Eastern Taliban, the Lower Paktia area. It's amongst other the Haqqanis and the Southern Talibs. And it's not as simple as I tell it. It's not all Southern Talibs from Kandahar and Helmand. They agree on everything. For example, Mullah Baradar, one of the founders of the Taliban, he's one of the moderate guys, and he was the one that the Easterners they wanted as a prime minister, but ended up being sidelined now. And it was after a compromise that the director of ISI, who showed up in Serena Hotel, it was by a coincidence that a couple of journalists saw him and took pictures of him. It wasn't supposed to be revealed, and officially he was there just to work on relations between the new government, the Taliban government, and Pakistan. But a lot of people, a lot of experts, they think that he was there to negotiate between the different fractions, and after he arrived, the government was formed quite quickly.
Can you talk, Najib, about the women's protests, the mass protest in Kabul of several hundred people cracked down on by the Taliban? They're holding signs that say things like women's rights or human rights. Also, in the fourth largest city in Mazar-e Sharif, you have the women marching. You had them in Herat as well.
Yes, I actually attended one of these demonstrations not so long ago. I think it's 5 or 6 days ago. I filmed one of these demonstrations and I interviewed the women, and it was basically women going out into the streets because they wanted to keep some of the rights that they had been giving during the former government's reign. They were really disappointed with no women being represented in the upcoming government. The government hadn't been announced at the time, but the Taliban had already said that it would be without women. And also in different other spheres of society, the Taliban has said it would be impossible to have women. So basically the women, they were out there saying that they wanted to fight for the rights that was a part of Islam, that women also had some of these positions that the Taliban thought was wrong for women to have. When I joined the demonstration, nothing happened. Nobody harassed them when I went with them. But I found out that an hour before I joined the demonstration, that a couple of Talibs, they had been very, physical and pushed the journalist away and tried to take his camera from him. And the day after, one of the women were hit by a Taliban, one of the demonstrators who I also saw at the previous demo. She was bleeding from her eye. So this was basically only the start of what was going to happen, what we were going to see. Because, for example, today, there had been a really hard crackdown on the demonstrations. It's not only on the women demonstrations, but also the other anti-Taliban demonstrations. You have a lot of people also going out now and chanting slogans against the Taliban and basically calling them agents of Pakistan and shouting slogans for some of the insurgents in the Panjshir region, the only region that was still fighting against the Taliban until a few days earlier, where the Taliban, they say they defeated them, but there are indications that there are some small pockets left up in the mountains. So it's basically a movement which is anti-Taliban right now. But at the same time, parallel with this anti-Taliban movement, you also have women just being pro-women, pro-human rights, as they're saying. That they're not talking about that they have any opinions about which political party has to rule the country. They just want the new leaders of Afghanistan to know that the women, they should have a place in society, that the women, they should have a place in all spheres of society, totally independently from what kind of a government Afghanistan is going to have.
And Najib, I'm wondering if you could talk whether there's been any indication that there is support for the Taliban coming to power, especially in the rural areas where people were weary from more than 20 years of warfare, and whether there's any indication that the Taliban are actually beginning to administer the basic services that a government is so important to a population from its government.
So Afghanistan is a very complicated story, but at the same time, it's not that complicated at all. You have two different narratives in Afghanistan, and both are true. You have the narrative of the cities, where there were, a slight progress during the former government, and you had more freedom in these parts of society. Women, they were getting more rights. People were getting much more educated, and you had a bigger middle class. You still had the so-called third world problems, economical crisis, poverty, and crime. But at the same time, you had certain segments of society who were progressing and having much better times than under the Taliban. At the same time, you had the rural area where they were suffering a lot because they were the ones who were experiencing aerial bombings from the U.S. airplanes, drone strikes from the U.S. Military, the military offensives. You had the battles out there in the rural areas. You had the Taliban putting mines, and you had assassinations. So the villages in the rural areas in Afghanistan, they had a really tough time. And at the same time, you had people in the bigger cities actually taking advantage of the international awareness and presence. Of course, also suffering from suicide bombings, for example, but not at all at the same level as people living in the rural areas. So in the rural areas, people are relieved because the war has stopped, because they're not facing the same threats from different militant groups. They're not facing, they're not scared of going out, sending their children to school because they're afraid of, sudden battles, sudden bombing, and all these things. But at the same time, you have people in the bigger cities getting their rights rolled back. There's being, the new government is cracking down on their personal freedom, political freedom, freedom of speech. So we have these clash of two narratives happening right now. So basically, people in the rural areas, they saw the Taliban as the lesser of two evils. They didn't see the Taliban as somebody who could provide a lot of services. They saw the Taliban as somebody who could help them avoid a lot of the negative consequences of the war, compared to the Afghan government, whose representatives were typically criminals. They called themselves police officers, but it was organized criminal groups actually just taking advantage of their uniforms and positions. But in the cities right now, they are paying the price. Earlier, it was the villagers paying the price for the progress in the cities, and now the cities are paying the price for the security in the rural area. So this is actually, the big contradiction of the reality in Afghanistan.
Najib Khaja, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Award-winning Danish-Afghan journalist and documentarian who's covered the wars in Afghanistan and Syria. He was in Kabul for the last 3 weeks, reporting for Danish television channel TV2, joining us from Denmark. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to the Gulf. Stay with us.
Changing tide, river rise, the water's high. Leave it all behind, let it flow by. The flood can't wash away these roots that grow for you. Fear won't blind me from the truth I can see through.
Changing Tide by Leila McCullough. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we turn to our ongoing coverage of the damage caused by Hurricane Ida, one of the strongest storms to ever hit the United States. On Tuesday, President Biden visited the storm-ravaged areas of New York and New Jersey.
And folks, the evidence is clear. Climate change poses an existential threat to our lives, to our economy, and the threat is here. It's not going to get any better. The question, can it get worse? We can stop it from getting worse.
Hurricane Ida caused widespread damage in the Gulf Coast as well, leaving much of Louisiana underwater. More than 500,000 electricity customers in Louisiana still have no power. Meanwhile, the U.S. Coast Guard is currently investigating reports of 350 oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico in the aftermath of the storm. This is how reporter Antonia Yuhas, who will be joining us in a minute, describes what happened to our next guest in her new piece for Rolling Stone. Quote, in the 8 days since Category 4 Hurricane Ida roared through her home and community in St. James Parish, Louisiana, 69-year-old Sharon Levine has watched crude oil spill out of a holding tank, seen flares shoot fire out of a petrochemical plant, and smelled a foul chemical stench from a fertilizer manufacturer. St. James Parish is located in the heart of Louisiana's Cancer Alley, an 85-mile stretch of communities along the banks of the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, where some 150 fossil fuel and petrochemical facilities operate, Antonia writes. This is a clip from a video Sharon Levine posted on social media as she documented the aftermath of Hurricane Ida in her community of St. James Parish last weekend.
Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Levine. I'm the director and founder of Rise St. James in St. James, Louisiana. And I just would like to report an oil leak at Marathon off Highway 18 West Bank in St. James, Louisiana. As you can see behind me, there's an oil spill over here at Marathon. You can see the oil coming off the side of the tank. And on the other side of the tank, you can see it from Birdland also.
Well, for more, Sharon Levine joins us now from St. James Parish, Louisiana, where she and her family have lived for generations. Her home heavily damaged by Hurricane Ida. Founder and director of Rise St. James, which works to stop the fossil fuel industry's pollution, expansion, and implement a just transition to renewable energy. She's a retired special ed teacher who taught in New Orleans for over 38 years, mother of 6 kids, grandmother of 12. Earlier this year, Sharon was awarded the 2021 Goldman Environmental Prize, also known as the Green Nobel Peace Prize. I'm sure, Sharon, that's not something you're thinking about at this moment as you rode out this storm in your community. Describe how it's affected your community, both the people who live there and looking out at Cancer Alley at this scores of petrochemical plants and how they've affected you.
Well, good morning, Amy. Thanks for having me. Our community is badly damaged. We have homes with the roofs off, or the mobile homes are totally demolished. Some of them have trees all in the yard, trees falling on driveways, have no power at all. We're trying to survive. Our public officials are not bringing necessities that we need, like ice, give us water. We don't have ice on a daily basis. Have to go out and find ice. After standing long lines to get gas. And we have, sometimes people bring us food who have generators. I didn't have a generator, but I have one now, and it only cools one room in my house. It's bad. It's really bad over here.
And Sharon, I wanted to ask you in terms of the what are officials saying as to when they will be able to restore electricity and water to the residents there, and also could you talk? You mentioned generators. It's hard to believe that a lot of these petrochemical plants did not have alternative energy, emergency energy, to be able to at least keep the power on for some of their basic needs, even if they were shut down. Could you talk about what the government has required of these companies, the local Louisiana authorities, in terms of resilience for these kinds of storms?
Industry has power. Always have backup whenever we have a storm. The residents of them have generators, and a lot of us don't have generators. My water was off because in a hurricane, it hit a pipeline or whatever, the trees and stuff fell on my pipeline. I didn't have water. Parish came to fix the pipe. They said it wasn't on their side. I have to pay someone to fix it myself. A brother had a tree that fell on his driveway, could not get out, and he's handicapped. I called the parish. He called the parish also. They said they don't go on private property. I said, but this is a disaster. Suppose he is sick and he can't get out. He said, I'm sorry, ma'am, don't go on private property. He was stuck until the citizens from New Orleans came, cut the tree so he can get out of his driveway.
Antonia Uhas, I want to bring you into this conversation. Oil and energy investigative journalist Bertha Fellow, whose new article for Rolling Stone is headlined "Hurricane Ida Pounded Louisiana's Cancer Alley. Its residents need help and demand change." Antonia, you tweeted yesterday, I believe, the extent of damage done from the fossil fuel and petrochemical industry here, from leaks, spills, flaring, ruptures, chemicals, releases, etc., as a result of Hurricane Ida, may be ultimately among the worst of such events ever recorded. Put this in context for us as you head back home to New Orleans, and the significance of Sharon as an environmental leader leading the struggle to challenge the fossil fuel industry that contaminates so much of the community that she and others are in.
Yeah, and I want to say good morning to Sharon, especially as another storm is heading her way and our way, and wishing her safety. So, you know, basically, there's several compounding problems happening right now. There isn't power to almost all of Cancer Alley, where Sharon lives. And some of the refineries and petrochemical facilities have power, but sort of shockingly, a lot of them don't. And because they don't, they are releasing horrible flares, black, dirty flares. They've been flooded. They're releasing chemicals. They're spilling. And they're not expected to have power for another 2 weeks. So you have the impacts on the citizens, on Sharon and her community, of not having power, of not having assistance. And then you have this petrochemical and fossil fuel industry that might spend 2 weeks unable to repair itself. And so you have compounding problems on top of each other, and that's just the onshore problem. Offshore, there's a whole host of drill ships, platforms, infrastructure that we know that's been damaged, but they can't get out there. So the Coast Guard has done flyovers, but the companies haven't gotten out there, so we still don't know the extent of the damage offshore. And part of that, again, is this power outage problem, which is still plaguing the state. That said, we already know of at least 350 reported spills in the Gulf and on land waters. I think the impacts are going to be, as you read, devastating, continue to be devastating when it's all taken into account.
And Antonia, can you talk about what has been Marathon's response after Sharon Levine's video documentation of that September 5th oil spill?
Yes, Marathon said to me that they noted that the spill had happened at that tank farm with the crude pouring over the edges, but that it hadn't contaminated air or water. But then I saw that they had actually filed with the State Department, Department of Environmental Quality, that there was impacts to both water and land. So I think the full extent, again, of that damage is yet to be known, because all we have right now is what Sharon is able to see with her eyes and report, and what the company is telling us. And this is a problem throughout the state, because the environmental regulator, the Department of Environmental Quality, is also having problems getting out, but also their air monitoring stations, 15 of them were out, I assume for outage, by the refineries, by the petrochemical plants to monitor, that's just the air quality, aren't there. So the access to information is extremely limited, also because of the ongoing storm damage, just making it difficult to get to areas.
You even have Shell, Antonia, an offshore oil site, preventing not picking up 100 of their offshore oil workers on the platform as the storm hit. They were stranded there?
Yeah, so there's two platforms. One, a Shell drill ship. Yes, they left 100 workers on the platform, which is entirely bizarre because generally evacuating workers from offshore platforms is standard procedure. We know from the videos that these workers were media that the ship took on extensive water. We know that it had to lose some of its equipment onto the ocean floor. They were evacuated. They finally are moving that rig off to Mississippi. They've been out on the water since the storm. That's only one of Shell's platforms. Another one of their facilities that takes on 200,000 barrels of oil a day and natural gas a day, it's a transit hub, has also been damaged during the storm, and we don't know the extent of the damage. There's oil sheets in the water from another drill ship. The commodities markets are already reporting that this is the worst harm to the oil sector from in the Gulf Coast since at least 2005 with the combination of Katrina and Rita. And I think, again, that's a sign that what we're going to start seeing is because of the extent of the period of damage, not having electricity, the winds, the high winds, that we're going to see more and more evidence of extensive spills, releases, ruptures, damages onshore, offshore, which we're already seeing.
And Sharon, I'd like to ask you what those who argue that the petrochemical industry is vital to jobs in Louisiana, what's your response to them, especially after crises like this?
My response is, what's more important, a human life or job? It's not that we're against industry that's trying to harm us, take our health and take our lives. We want to live. We want to breathe clean air. These industries are not allowing us to breathe clean air or drink clean water.
And finally, Antonia, Entergy. I remember seeing all the Entergy vans after Hurricane Katrina. Now, 1 million customers lost power after Ida. Still hundreds of thousands in darkness, no electricity. The private company and what should be done about it.
Yeah, so only about 50% of Louisiana that lost power has had its power restored. All of the lower-lying areas where Sharon is located, the southeast of the state, are almost still without power and are expected to be for 2 weeks. Basically what folks are talking about here is that the problem with Entergy is that it is a highly centralized, fossil fuel intensive electricity company. Coal, natural gas in particular are its baselines. And that what needs to happen is a decentralized, community-based, renewable energy system where you've got power provided closer to and within control of the consumer, that it can be separated out. So if you lose power up here, you still have power everywhere else. And that power is helping to mitigate the climate crisis, not contribute to it through coal, natural gas.
An Alliance for Affordable Energy Analysis compared New Orleans to the nation and Louisiana as a whole and found the city not only has excessively high durations and frequency of power outages, but that they're also unequal. Gentilly, New Orleans East, Lower Ninth Ward, neighborhoods which are majority people of color and low income experience the greatest proportion of outages, demonstrating a clear form of environmental racism. The analysis says New Orleans also has the second highest percentage percentage of household income spent on energy bills in the country. That reading from Antonia's National Geographic article. We want to thank you both for being with us. We'll continue to report on what's happened in the Gulf. Antonia Juhas, oil and energy investigative journalist, Sharon Levine, founder and director of Rise St. James in Louisiana, recipient of the 2021 Goldman Environmental Prize, known as the Green Nobel Peace Prize. Sharon, stay safe, and good luck, Antonia, as you head back home to New Orleans. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joe Stiglitz on unemployment benefits ending on Labor Day, on vaccine inequity, and the Federal Reserve Board, why AOC and others are demanding the replacement of Jerome Powell. Stay with us.
I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. Well, I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. Said I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. And if I share with you my story, would you share your dollar with me? Bad times are coming and I reap what I done sowed. Hey, hey. Well, let me tell you something, all that glitters ain't gold. Long old troublesome road, and I'm looking for somebody come and help me carry this load. I need a dollar, 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 that's what I
Need a Dollar by Aloe Black. Here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Unemployment benefits for millions of U.S. workers expired on Labor Day after President Biden declined to press the Democratic-led Congress to extend assistance, even as many states suffered their worst surge of the pandemic. An estimated 9.3 million jobless workers lost benefits, along with 26 million members of their households who relied on the income. The cutoff of aid came after the Labor Department reported the U.S. economy added just 235,000 jobs in August, a significant slowdown due largely to the spread of the Delta coronavirus variant. The unemployment rate for African Americans rose 0.6 of a percentage point in August to 8.8%. For more, we're joined by Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize-winning economist, Columbia University professor, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. We want to discuss a number of issues, from vaccine equity to the Federal Reserve Board. But first, let's begin with these unemployment benefits ending. Joe Stiglitz, the significance of this.
Well, this is extraordinarily disturbing. You know, we should have passed a law that said so long as the unemployment rate remained elevated, in particular places, it's very, very serious. We should have continued those unemployment benefits. The numbers, 3/4 of those on unemployment are going to see their benefits cut, or most of those eliminated. And we aren't back to really normal. So this is going to feed into the problems posed by the Delta variant, because that itself has slowed the economy down. As you mentioned, the employment numbers were not that good the last month. And now, on top of that, we're going to have the problem of insufficiency of aggregate demand, because these people who are going to lose their benefits won't be able to spend.
But Joe Stiglitz, what do you say to those? There have been lots of media reports in recent weeks, and many Republicans, like Senator Ted Cruz, saying that employers are not able to find employees because people are preferring to stay on unemployment rather than get jobs. What's your response to this point of view?
Yeah, well, actually, this is an area where we've been able to get real data in real time, because we've done, you might say, an experiment, because different states have reduced their benefits, cut off their benefits. A large number of conservative states have already done that. So we've been able to see what happens to employment when you cut off benefits. Do people rush back to get jobs? And were those states that cut off those benefits, did that solve their problem of a labor shortage? Answer, unambiguously, no. It's clear the reason that people aren't going back to work. One, they don't want to get the disease, and our workplace is often a place where people do get the disease. Secondly, we don't have adequate child care, and that means with schools being shut down, opened up, shut down, they don't want to leave their children alone. And one of the important provisions of the President Biden's program that's in the reconciliation bill is actually to address that issue. You might say it's a real supply side issue that will help the labor supply, but cutting off unemployment benefits has a minuscule, estimating something like 7% of those who got cut off from benefits actually wound up with jobs.
And Joseph Stiglitz, I'd like to turn to another topic, the Federal Reserve Board. President Biden will soon have to decide on the new chair for the Federal Reserve Board. There have been some Congress members, progressive members of Congress like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, who are calling for Biden to replace the current chair, Jerome Powell, for neglecting to take on the climate crisis and weakening financial regulations. I'd like to get your perspective on this, and especially not just on the issue of Powell's track record on climate change, but also the fact that he's continuing to pursue this cheap money policy that allows corporations and Wall Street to get money at low interest rates and then, of course, invest it in the stock market and continue to drive the stock market up rather than in real production or capital expenditures. Your sense of whether Jerome Powell deserves to stay?
Well, this is one of the really difficult decisions because no one wants to disturb the economy as we're in the process of healing the economy. And it was a kind of decision that I was involved in more than 20 years ago when Alan Greenspan came up for reappointment under President Clinton. Now, Powell has done you might say, a reasonable job in responding to the pandemic. He's not gone the way you might say a hard money person would worried about inflation. But that's a low bar. Almost anybody reasonable would have taken the kinds of measures that the Federal Reserve took. The hard questions on the macroeconomic side are what happens when we get starting to recover? How soon do you increase interest rate? Are you about inflation? How do you see that trade-off? And one of the things that we know is that the only time that we bring into the labor market minorities, disadvantaged people, and the only time we get wage compression is when we have a really tight labor market. And to me, it's worth risking a little inflation in order to address some of the grave inequalities in our society. And I wonder whether he will be the right person in that critical moment. Moreover, one of the critical issues going forward is, are we going to have another financial crisis like we had back in 2008? Memories are short, and a lot of people think that's ancient history, but it's not. It can come back again, and that's where his proclivity to side with Wall Street and engage in deregulation is very troublesome. The Dodd-Frank bill did not adequately deal with the re-regulating the financial system, and since then, the regulations that we've had. What we really need is strengthening regulations to deal with encouraging capital to move, as you said, into productive activities, and dealing with the real risk not only of the financial excessive risk-taking that we saw in 2008, but a new set of risks that are on the horizon, and those are the climate risks. He says those are issues that Congress ought to deal with, but they are issues of financial stability. We have a repricing of fossil fuel assets, other assets that are going to be affected by climate change. It will make what happened with the subprime mortgage market look like a picnic. And what that did to our financial system is an important lesson why we have to include climate risk in any stress testing.
Joe, we want to get to the costs of war. You wrote a book on this. But first, the World Health Organization's Africa director has condemned plans by the U.S. and other wealthy countries to offer third-dose COVID vaccine booster shots, while only 2% of Africa's 1.3 billion people have been fully vaccinated. Dr. Matshidiso Moeti said the U.S. should have given priority and must do it now to poorer nations. This is what they said.
Moves by some countries globally to introduce booster shots threaten the promise of a brighter tomorrow for Africa. As some richer countries hoard vaccines, they make a mockery, frankly, of vaccine equity.
You've just written an article on this issue along with Lori Wallach. And I'm wondering if you can talk about, it's called Will Corporate Greed Prolong the Pandemic? Can you talk about vaccine equity?
Sure. I mean, it's very clear that we're not going to be safe until the whole world is safe. As long as the disease is festering someplace in the world, there are going to be mutations. We know that. And we know that these mutations can be more contagious, more dangerous, and even more vaccine resistant. So it's in our own self-interest that we get the disease controlled everywhere. But right now, there are two problems. This issue of vaccine equity, who gets the vaccine and who doesn't, and disproportionately, the United States is getting a real access to the vaccine, and the developing countries simply are not. But to me, the real issue is lack of supply. There is no excuse a year, well more than a year after the COVID-19 started, well after we discovered the vaccines that worked, that there should be this kind of supply shortage. The market economy has the ability to produce these vaccines. I'm afraid that they're limiting the production to keep the price up. The head of Pfizer was hoping that he could sell each dose for $175, something that costs far, far less than that. So to me, the first priority ought to be revving up production so that there is a supply for everybody in the world.
And finally, the costs of war. You wrote a book on this subject as Biden pulls U.S. troops out of Afghanistan.
Well, the title of my book we wrote more than a decade ago was The $3 Trillion War. Pointing out the high cost of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. We knew that our numbers were conservative, but as time mounted on and the cost mounted up, what we've discovered is that the cost just of caring for our
we have 20 seconds.
Is in the trillions of dollars. The wars have been little benefit, but an enormous cost to our society.
We want to thank you so much for being with us, Joe Stiglitz, Nobel Prize-winning economist, Columbia University professor, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Among his books, People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. That does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe.